This video is about Ludleth, the most mysterious of the Lords of Cinder, and his homeland, Courland. Unlike the other four, Ludleth is not a boss we must hunt on our journey. He is a friendly, helpful NPC, one so easily forgotten. I'll also talk about Aldrich, the Soulfeeder, Gundyr, the Crystal Sages, and Oceiros, as their stories are linked to his. But before I talk about Ludleth, I must explain what and where Courland, his homeland, is. But before I do even that, I must explain what and where Astora was, and its significance for the narrative, as it wholly parallels Courland. I will also briefly talk about the main conflict of the series, the Firelink conspiracy, as it is impossible to decipher Ludleth's story without first understanding it. Courland is to Lothric what Astora was to Lothric. That is to say, Courland is the Middle Earth, the vast territory that encompasses the intermediary realm. In the case of Lothric, the three realms were the Underworld, Irithyll, the Heaven and Earth, the World of Man, the secluded territory of nobles whose entry was, after the creation of the curse, forbidden to outsiders, and whose exit was later a one-way trip, and finally, Astora, the Middle Earth which connected the other two. The city-states Baldur and Katarina, Irithyll, areas like the Firelink Shrine, the Depths, the Undead Burg and Parish, the Darkroot Garden, and so on, were all part of the country Astora, with New Londo being its capital. The four kings ruled over New Londo in the microcosm, but also over Astora in the macrocosm, though each city-state had autonomy. For instance, Iudex was presided over by Gundyr, a presumed bastard of the royal family, and Baldur was ruled by a warrior king named Randall. Each of the four kings represented a cardinal direction, and thus, the four of them as one ruled over the country. Take note of this fact, as it will be significant when discussing Courland. Astora's nobility hailed from lesser branches of the ancient clans of Velka and Gwyn, and the world of men views them as lesser for this reason. Before the war against the demons, Lothric's underworld and Astora used to be connected through the depths, which were, in ancient times, akin to our old Silk Road. Astora was also linked to the upper realm via the place that would later be reformed to become the Sun's Fortress. The arena of the Iron Golem boss fight was once the location of the gates that led to the provinces of Courland and Karim, and from them, one could travel to Anor Londo, the upper strata of the world of men, where Gwyn's family resided, the so-called gods. Astora was also the place where the curse was first unleashed. To be precise, the curse began when a maiden of the Way of White, a religion created by Gwyn, in partnership with Nito, infected a corpse of the graveyard near the Firelink Shrine with a contaminated spark of flame through its eye socket, bringing it back to life as an undead. As soon as the curse had begun to take effect, Gwyn orders the closure of the gates to his domain. Astora was also the area most affected by the spread of the Abyss, as it is intrinsically related to the curse. First, New Londo, its capital, fell to ruin by the undead curse, and the four kings and their knights were tempted by the serpent calf in reaction. They wished to negate the effects of the curse by draining the lives of others, though, predictably, the art of life drain was a Faustian bargain, which corrupted them into monsters not unlike hollows themselves. Then fell Irithyll, and the rebels saw in Gundyr a figure representative of the royal family, bastard or not. They decapitated every statue sculpted in his image, and ruined the township. In both instances, the rebels wanted, ultimately, to overthrow Gwyn and conquer the secluded heaven above. What the man who fell to the temptation of the Abyss did not know is that the spread of the Abyss and the prolonging of the Age of Fire depend on each other, so their ambition was futile from the start, and they were but useful idiots. To embolden the Abyss is to embolden Gwyn's son. The curse of undead extracts men's souls to fuel the sun above, and it empowers the darkness below. Thus, the mutual interest of Gwyn and Nito, one wishes to rule below, the other above. The curse halts the natural cycle of nature, of both reincarnation and of day and night. Gwyn fears the coming of the night, and in reaction to it, fabricated a curse, with Sif's help, that would bring forth a new dawn, which is the reason for the name of the religion he created, Way of White. As explained in previous videos, Velka devised the proper instruments to combat Gwyn's curse, the fire-linking bonfire. Through selfless sacrifice, the opposite of the modus operandi of Gwyn and Nito. One can drain the sun's fire by kindling a bonfire in the underworld, calling upon the night. This draining is only possible because of the dark sign, as it linked men's souls to the sun. Velka ingeniously found a way to exploit the very mechanism designed by her opposites. Gwyndolin was a homunculus, an alchemical rebis created by Sif, with Gwyn and Velka's souls, and empowered by the essence of the dragons, by order of Velka to serve as Gwyn's successor in the role of King of the Gods. He disguised himself as a girl, through the reversal ring and his illusory magic, and was raised as a daughter and not a son, as a way of concealing his ambition to usurp the throne. Gwyndolin conspired against Gwyn and usurped his power. He infected Gwyn with the curse and manipulated him into linking the fire. An illustration of this coup can be seen on the miracles of Lothric. By linking the fire, Gwyn became the first Lord of Cinder, the title being a mockery, an inversion of his deific title, Lord of Light. Velka's karmic justice was then finally served upon the greatest of sinners, upon the man who committed the first sin. Propaganda was manufactured to beckon undead to follow in Gwyn's footsteps. Gwyn was seen by humanity as a god emperor, his rule representing the heyday of mankind. So, instead of exposing and vilifying Gwyn, and openly proclaiming Velka's justice was served, Velka's reputation was in shambles. She was perceived as a rogue witch. Velka's followers lied to the journeying undead about their true purpose, which was to undermine Gwyn's will of prolonging the Age of Fire. The primordial serpents were invited by Velka to become her co-conspirators, for the Firelink conspiracy would benefit them as much as men. The world's surface would usher in the night, and the dragons would be restored, and men would return to their primordial forms, but unshackled by the curse, free to start again, free from the consequences of the first sin, which Velka, the goddess of sin, would mend. Just like her followers and statues, in the microcosm, mend the sins of our protagonists, at the cost of his souls. Both Cav and Frampt shamelessly lied to the player, portraying him as the chosen one to embolden his will to fulfill the prophecy they helped manifest into reality. And they play both sides, so that even those who seek to forsake Gwyn and the fire will become pawns of the greater conspiracy. In summary, by spreading death and curse, one prolongs the Age of Fire by fueling the naturally fading sun, and by linking the fire, one drains the sun and brings forth the night. Astora was the Middle Earth, which connects the underworld with the symbolic heaven on earth. The royals of Astora were lesser than those of the world of men. Gwyndolin, a homunculus who was seen as a bastard of the royal family, usurped Gwyn and forced him into becoming the first Lord of Cinder. Propaganda cemented firelinking as being the continuation of Gwyn's will, when the reverse is true. Cath and Frampt are two sides of the same coin, the coin being Velka's Firelink conspiracy, which was supervised by Gwyndolin, her ideological heir, after her self-sacrifice. With Gwyndolin in power, the Way of White, Gwyn's religion, was completely subverted. The Blue Sentinels, a continuation of Velka's, and later, Gwyndolin's Knights of the Dark Moon, took over. The chief god became Kaita, the goddess of tears, an alias of Velka, which hid and inverted her reputation of rogue deity, and supporting firelinking became the goal of the faith. The undead were once the villains of the faith, called agents of the dark, and Nito's paladins led hunts, crusades against them, so that the curse was spread, ironically generating more undead who has to be killed, creating a cycle of death to fuel Gwyn's and Nito's immortal rules. They even piles the corpses of undead and burns them in residential areas, so that the accursed sparks of flame would contaminate Astora's citizens. Interestingly enough, Velka's bonfire, which is also created from undead, is a subversion of those. One spreads death and curse and is created by the sacrifice of others. The other heals those in need and fights against the curse and is created by self-sacrifice. The reformed Way of White subverted the role of the undead. They were now martyrs, saints, and the protagonists of the religion. Now I can finally begin explaining Lothric's configuration. Lothric is an inverse Lordran, in the sense that the nobility is composed of followers of Velka and of the firelinking ideology. Its king and queen were Flann and Guinevere, Gwyn's firstborn and eldest daughter, who'd fled on Orlando before Gwyndolin's coup, in accordance with their mother's scheme. The backbone of Dark Souls 3's plot, then, is the inverse of that of the first game. An underdog revolutionary who was, this time around, an actual bastard son of the royal lineage, a man named Sullivan, rose through the ranks and devised a counter-conspiracy to combat Firelinking and restore the Age of Fire. He would usurp Gwyndolin, the second king of the gods, and restore the Way of White into its original form, its goal being, as was at first, to suppress the curse, so that the sun would be fueled by the souls of men. But before Sullivan's infiltration of the Way of White, the institution held a bizarre operation in Courland. As I have claimed, Courland directly parallels Astora, both geographically, as the intermediary land. Courland essentially means course land, as well as courtyard land, for it is in the middle of Lothric and Irithyll, as well as narratively, as the place where the lower nobility lived alongside the masses, and from which the curse and the abyss were first unleashed. Courland's territory consists of the Firelink Shrine, the backyard of Lothric Castle, the place later known as the Consumed King's Garden, the Undead Settlements, the Farron Keep, the Road of Sacrifices, the Cathedral of the Deep, the place later known as the Catacombs of Carthus, and the place later known as the Profaned capital. However, Courland not only parallels Astora narratively and geographically, as it exists in Lothric, it quite literally originates from the ruins of Astora, though fused with the drifting lands of the New World, that is, of Dark Souls 2. I will explain Lothric's founding in detail in a separate video. Courland's main symbol is the square, which symbolizes the four corners of the earth. It is, of course, a reference, a continuation of the legacy of the four kings. Oceiros was the king of Courland, and he had 4 children, each ruling over a quarter of the kingdom's territory. 5 thrones were built on Courland's own Firelink shrine, one for each prince of Courland, who were assessed to link the fire, and one for Lothric's special prince who was assessed to usurp the flame after it had been weakened 4 consecutive times, at last having become weak enough for the Age of Fire to be put to rest, for men to erase the dark sign. Gundyr was Oceiros' firstborn. He shares much in common with Gwyn's firstborn, Flann. He is tall, strong, and like the original ancient dragons, emblematic of the raw build. In his prime, he could briefly summon powerful, stormy winds with just stomps, similar to Flann, who could, additionally, conjure lightning, and fought with his bare hands as much as with a weapon. He presided over the south, and ruled from a place later known as the Profaned capital. He was seen as a champion in the making, especially fit to link the fire, a boy born with extraordinary vigor. The territory he presided over was strongly influenced by Volgan, a New World capital known for its greed and wealth, that, before the Iron King's downfall, was a beacon of Velko worship in its original continent. By Ilium Lois, a capital once part of Feroza, known for its warrior culture, and by Drang Lake, whose clergy would gain prominence in Courland, and whose disbanded army would become a defensive unit of Irithyll. As a brief aside, the Lord Vessel which holds a portion of the First Flame, which was increasingly emboldened by firelinking, is akin to a reproduction of similar structures from Volgan. Gundyr was given a chain that would not only bind him to his duty, symbolically, but also ferment within him a covetous nature. Magic chains, then called Chains of the Embedded, were given to greedy undead, that is, to cannibals and thieves who had been imprisoned in Ilium Lois. They emboldened their desires and caused them to eat more and more of their kin, until only the strongest among them survived, his fellow prisoners having been devoured. By that point, the greedy undead had become an obscenely strong dragon-like monster, a covetous demon, and the knight in training would slay them in a ritualistic procedure to prove his worth. This ritual was inspired by the tales of dragon slaying of ancient times. Just like before, those who proved their might in battle against the dragons were ordained knights. Back to Gundyr, he was both the knight and the dragon in one. He was a champion, the heroic warrior who'd link the fire, sacrificing his powerful soul, but also the dragon, as he had to covet in order to strengthen his soul, so that it could feed the fire. The halberd that was given to him, also a symbol of his duty and eternal service, for it is said to never break, was molded after the coiled sword of the bonfires, and its ability to break poise is emblematic of the storm, of the raw power of the ancient dragons. It parallels, in a way, a weapon that would be a symbol of the king who'd succeed Gundyr. Gundyr's design also references a character from Demon Souls, King Doran, a barbarian who defeated the dragons and became a king through might. This fact will be particularly important to remember for later. Gundyr's mask doubles as a crown, and it depicts Velka with her concealing veil. The relation of Velka, the rogue, occult deity, and her followers is like that of the master manipulator and the simpleton, the same relationship the de facto rulers of Volgan had with their puppet ruler. The twins, later known as Crystal Sages, were scholars first and foremost. One presided over the east, the other over the west, mirroring the twin witches of the Wizard of Oz, which is amply referenced in the Dark Souls series. Their territory encompassed the Farron Woods, as well as the Road of Sacrifices and the Cathedral of the Deep. One of the brothers would become a recluse and abandon his duty, as he'd become obsessed with his individualistic scholarly pursuit, like a certain big hat magician. His negligence would create major issues in the future. The power vacuum he caused would not go unnoticed by opportunists. The other twin would not only oversee his territory as a lord, but directly intervene as a watchman. He'd join Farron's Undead Legion, whose main units, the Abyss Watchers, wore hats designed after the square, a symbol of Courland, and teach his subjects spells so they could help protect the realm from invaders, hollows, and later, the spread of the Abyss in its increasingly distilled form. He was a man of the masses, a passionate teacher by nature. One twin was the opposite of the other. One cared deeply for his people, the other cared not for anyone besides himself. But both dealt the same with their crowns. They'd put them aside, wholly uninterested in what they represented. And finally, there was Ludleth, the last born. A small, unremarkable man, so easily forgotten. He'd preside over the north, taking care of the undead settlements, the humble home of the peasantry. His weak constitution worsened when he became a student of the forbidden art of transposition, as he'd snatch contaminated corpses to dissect and study, and the curse would take a toll on him. While the princes presided over their territories, one exception aside, Oceiros, Courland's king, a distant relative of Velka's branch of royalty, would work in secrecy to produce an alchemical rebis of his own. His special child set to usurp the role of Gwyndolin, to sit on the throne of the king of the gods. Oceiros did not want to follow the Firelink conspiracy to the end, but merely pretended. He had ordered his children to go along with it as a way of buying time to manifest his own conspiracy, which would, ultimately, produce a new worldly empire, like Gwyn's in the dawn of the Age of Fire, with his family as the new pantheon of gods. He envied and resented both the old and new dynasties, and coveted for one of his own. For his plan to work, Oceiros has to correctly decipher and reproduce Gwyndolin's alchemical formula. I will briefly explain Gwyndolin's origin and nature for the sake of context. Gwyndolin was a product of the research of Sif, the Scaleless, and was made from Gwyn and Velka's souls. He was created to rule over the accursed era of firelinking, never giving in to the curse, for he was truly immortal, invulnerable to its grasp. It was for that reason that he was able to implant the dark sign into Gwyn without contaminating himself, and he did that by getting close to Gwyn, who, despite believing Gwyndolin to be a bastard, saw him as his beloved's daughter, and let his guards down. Gwyndolin would be deeply saddened by the betrayal he was ordered to perform, for he dearly loved his father, despite his great sin. His father's treatment of him, despite his bastard nature, would warm his heart to the bastards of the world, and the kingdom he would create upon the ruins of the world of man, Irithyll, the Boreal Valley, would call upon all of the royal bastards scattered through the realms. Any who had godlike blood, no matter how diluted, was welcomed and embraced by him. Bastardry is one of Dark Souls 3's most important themes, as this series will discuss. Oceiros would keep trying and trying to produce an alchemical magnum opus, but his efforts resulted in countless wild abominations, and he'd send them away to be eternally confined in the Irithyll dungeon. His first somewhat successful experiment was Yorshka, a failed rebis, for, much like Priscilla, who she parallels, she turned out too feminine. However, Oceiros cared only for pure gold, and anything lesser was rubbish to him. Yorshka would be hidden away and exiled, like her savage, malformed brothers. Yet Gwyndolin took note of her arrival in Irithyll, and, moved by pity and compassion, welcomed her. He embraced her as a sister, and cared for her in an Orlando, sealing her from the outside world, from its dangers, within a tower only accessible by crossing an invisible bridge. Lothric's royalty was also in a desperate race to produce a Rebis, a child who embodied both the feminine and the masculine, who was still strong enough to resist a profound hollowness, so he had enough darkness in him, enough dark sigils, enough curse, to wrest the flame, the drained sun, from its mantle once the time came. This Rebis would be the inverse of Gwyndolin, whose being was part dragon, and thus, truly immortal, immune to the effects of the curse. To both avoid the spread of the curse in the territory and advance the progress of firelinking, the clergy of Courland's west, who de facto ruled over the territory in the absence of one of the twins, would order the capture of those that were close to hollowing. Often the older, aged men and women. The suspected undead were jailed in vehicles and transported to the main cathedral through the road of sacrifices. As the name of the road implies, the undead were sent to their deaths, but it was no regular sacrifice, no quick, dignified execution. After all, the goal of the operation was both to keep them from spreading their accursed sparks of soul through death, as well as to empower a firelinker. They were eaten alive by the head of the clergy, who was a man named Aldrich. His sacred duty was dualistic, for he basked in sinful, filthy acts for the greater good. He'd volunteered to take the place of the missing twin who had forsaken his duty. But Aldrich would eventually fall prey to corruption. He developed a taste for human flesh, and felt glorified in gorging on his fellow man. He ate so many men he contracted blight pus, like the greedy undead of the depths of Lordran. The more a man eats his own kin, the more he bloats, and eventually, he dissolves into sludge. Still, Aldrich abided by his quest, and when the time came, when he'd become sufficiently strong, when his soul was enough to feed the flames, he became a martyr, a lord of Cinder, by linking the fire. With Aldrich's absence, a new mechanism has to be employed to keep the curse from spreading. Executioners would decapitate undead, and their bodies were buried in the church's graveyard. Servants of the church were appointed as gravekeepers. They'd repeatedly kill the reviving undead of the cemetery, through a method which drains their blood and delays their reincarnation. The undead settlement had a mechanism of its own to deal with the curse. The entire commune was constructed around a huge mausoleum which hosted a witch tree. The suspected undead were put in cages and transported to this graveyard, so that the curse wouldn't infect their neighbors, but be gradually absorbed by the tree alongside the contaminated souls, whose special nature enabled it to serve as a beacon for the souls of the dead. The tree was like Aldrich himself. Its duty was sacred, but dualistic in nature, as it too fed on the plague to contain it. In fact, it's also like Gwyndolin, who had to commit atrocities and sustain a huge life for the greater good. The men tasked with transporting the cages attached tall wooden doors to their backs to prevent themselves from spreading the curse, like the undead clerics of the Reformed way of white. When Aldrich was still eating human flesh, he invited others to his feasts. He develops the desire to share with others the joy of imbibing the final shudders of life, when luxuriating in the screams of his victims. His most frequent guest was Earl Arstor, an old noble of Karim who develops a particular taste for human blood. Like Aldrich, Arstor had been a man dedicated to his religious duties, which followed Velka's will. He was responsible for the creation of the Bite Rings, which were designed to aid undead in their firelinking journeys, and he had a stash of purging stones, which he distributed among Velka's agents. After Aldrich sacrificed himself in the fire, and the systemic delivery of human flesh through the road of sacrifices ceased its operations, Arstor was impeded from fulfilling his depraved desires. However, the deep darkness that had been growing inside him coveted still. Regular meals did not suffice. He couldn't live without his prized delicacy. Arstor marched through Courland, promising eternal life to all undead, to all commoners, and those who feared the curse would follow him. He wore the skull ring, which he had concocted in a dark ritual. The ring would attract the attention of all those close to hollowing, to himself. Having formed a militia of men who hungered for souls, Arstor and his followers would embark on a crusade against their fellow men, impaling them and drinking their bloods to the point of drunkenness. Arstor's spear became so deeply imbued with the rotten flesh and blood of men from the many impalements it could poison with a scratch. Its coiling tip saps the vigor of its victims and fed it to Arstor. Eventually, Arstor's most ardent followers would have their forms twisted by the blood they drank. Their teeth sharpened into fangs, their arms became enlarged, fingers warped into claws, and a sinister glow burned in their eyes. They became half beast, half man, and as such, were called lycanthropes. Arstor himself would become monstrous as well, even more so than his followers. He'd become the abyssal beast called Soulfeeder. Courland was facing an existential threat. Farron's undead legion was gatekeeping the swamp, preventing the attackers from reaching Irithyll and the southern capital of Courland, bravely resisting against the aggressors, chaining the lycanthropes upon wooden crosses to restrict their movements, while also keeping them from dying near people and contaminating them with their accursed souls. Oceiros had been, for a long time, too obsessed with his research, too attached to his long-term goal to care about his own kingdom. After much effort, Ocelot was produced, a child of dragons, a rabies who'd been successfully imbued with the essence of the dragons, like Gwendolyn himself. But he too turned out to be a failure, like his rejected sister. His immortality had manifested incorrectly, and he would never grow beyond infancy. He was said to be an eternal newborn, and this would unleash the madness that was seething within Oceiros, prompting him to experiment with the formula on himself. As a result, he was consumed by the dragon's essence, and became a pale, scaleless abomination. The best Oceiros could do was become like Sif, whose imperfect existence had prompted his own descent into sin and madness. Oceiros' name continues the Egyptian theme of Sif's. One is based on Seth, the Egyptian adversary, the envious god of chaos. Like the dragons represents the primordial chaos before creation, the primal materia, and the other is based on Oceiros, the god whose being was shattered into pieces, like the dragons after they'd been defeated during the Age of Ancients, and fragmented themselves into lesser forms, giving rise to the animal kingdom, the serpents representing their phallus, which desired wholeness. The invading hollows, now so consumed by the dark they were leaking with abyssal pus and turning into serpentine monstrosities, like the Soulfeeder himself, were headed for the King's Garden and the Firelink Shrine. If they managed to take hold of the garden, they would be one step away from ruining Lothric Castle, and thus ending the Firelink conspiracy. Gundyr, Courland's champion, was on his way to protect the King's Garden and the Firelink Shrine. After crossing the bridge that linked Lothric to the lower realms, he destroyed this to ensure no beast could follow. He'd then fight against every draconic aberration he'd find. The battlefield would become a pool of toxic waste, of poisonous hollow blood. The more Gundyr fought, the more the chain festered within him a deep desire, a yearning for wholeness, like that of the serpents, and he began to gorge on the pus, bloating and acquiring the same red ocular glow of his enemies. As he was losing himself, glimpses of his duty would guide him to the shrine so he could link the fire, but he ultimately forgot even that which had once been his eternal anchor, the very reason he had sought strength. As he faced waves of monsters with all his might, he ended up becoming one himself, and instead of linking the fire, he'd stand as its final gatekeeper. The greed of Volgan's men backfired, as it had in times past. Some of the pus-infected men managed to avoid Gundyr and reach the castle, but Lothric's knights and their wyverns would face them. The surviving knights would go hollow, and the wyverns would become infected with the pus. There was a side of the square, yet unprotected, its frailest side. Arstor, the Soulfeeder, the leader of the rebellion, the chief agent of the Dark, was heading towards the undead settlements. The people needed a hero, or else they would soon be eaten away by the beast. Should the witch tree that stood at its end be destroyed, Lothric itself would never heal from the plague. Ludleth was a prince, thus the golden crown on his head. But he was not like his brothers. He was meek, he was frail. As said before, he was a student of the dark art of transposition. By channeling the soul of past beings through a transposing kiln, the artist can reshape it into a memory it held within itself. For instance, through the soul of a warrior, one would be able to manifest the sword he used to wield in combat. Through the soul of a sorcerer, one would be able to manifest a scroll he'd memorized. In Courland, transposing kilns were created by stitching the hide of multiple crystal lizards together. Crystal lizards were abundant in Courland, so much so that it is only within its territory that the mutant, ravenous crystal lizards can be found. The transposing kiln harbors a deep darkness within it. It is a miniature portal of darkness, which is how, through it, one can investigate the memories of souls. Darkness is forgetfulness and the past, light is memory and the future. For a different example of this esoteric principle manifested in the world of Dark Souls, in the second game, we're told that, in the New World, when a Hollow becomes nearly devoid of light, forgetting his very name, and even his birth, the bright, soulful memory of Drangleic begins to inhabit his dreams, and dreams only occur during one's sleep, when one closes his eyes and basks in the dark. Like a moth to a flame, the Hollowing Undead is attracted to a portal of deep, damp darkness, and by jumping through it, he reaches Drangleic, a dreamland. The same mechanism is the force behind the transposing kilns. The artist must grab and insert a soul through a portal of darkness to access it, and distill a memory from it. However, transposition was deemed a taboo, for it requires one to harvest the souls of the deceased to perform it. Defiling graves and interacting with the dead would lead one to become infected with the curse if the souls had been contaminated, and so, the art was declared forbidden. This is inspired by real-world history, as the church used to forbid men from dissecting and studying corpses and so on. Also, transposition was a dark art, still, and the dark arts were universally considered taboo throughout the lands and times, and for good reason. Thus, the practitioners of the art were punished with exile, as they were a danger to their own land. Ludleth couldn't bear to witness his territory falling to ruin, but he knew better than anyone that he was no warrior. He was but a frail, weak, short man. He had no chance of slaying a monster, a dragon. That is, unless he committed a great sin. Unless he defiles the grave of a great knight of times past, stole his soul, and transposed it to acquire his skills. He would be exposing himself as a hypocritical ruler, and be condemning himself to self-exile. Ludleth would disguise himself and sneak into the mausoleum, and search for the tomb of such a man. But what he found there surprised him. It was no man, but a woman who has the fiercest soul. A knight of Mira, the harsh land known for its brave warriors, named Irithyll. Ludleth would transpose from the soul the gear Irithyll had worn in life. Fortunately for him, she too has to wear a mask to conceal her face. She used it to hide her hollowness, and he would wear it to conceal his identity. He would wield her sword, which had cut through so many hollows it had become stronger against those close to the dark. Not as himself, but as Irithyll, the greatest knight of Mira, Ludleth would have the courage to face the Soulfeeder, and he slew the beast in a battle which took place at the graveyard. Immediately after defeating the Soulfeeder, Ludleth transposed a chunk of its soul into the skull ring to draw the attention of all monsters to himself, and burned its corpse. He went on to slay every remaining foe, protecting the people of the settlement from their covetous frenzy. He'd also been wearing the Silver Serpent's ring, which was multiplying the amount of souls he was absorbing. His strength was increasing exponentially. Followed by several common folk who'd seen in him a hero, and were by him inspired to join the cause, he marched towards the edge of Courland, defeating hordes of monsters along the way. He was set to go to the Firelink shrine. Upon crossing the cemetery of Ash, he found his eldest brother, Gundyr, standing before him, wholly taken by the dark. His last challenge would be defeating the strongest man in all of Courland. It was as though his brother was there to judge his worth in combat. Ludleth's name means half-man. He was born light and frail. Gundyr's name derives from Gundyr, meaning warrior. Gundyr is notably a warrior king from a Germanic epic. A day ago, it might have drawn laughter, the idea of the eldest and youngest brother at odds. But now, their battle may have echoed through legend, if only there was anyone sane left to witness it. One of the brothers had fallen to the temptation of greed, despite being so powerful, despite having such a wondrous body and soul. The other had resisted it, despite his pathetic, pale frame and soul. Each had an artifact that emboldens their desire, but only one fell prey to its influence. Upon defeating Gundyr, he pierced him with the coiled sword of a bonfire and headed for the shrine. Ludleth had passed his final trial. He threw away Irithyll's mask, hid away his serpent ring, and linked the fire, the first to do so in Courland, in all of Lothric, subverting the expectations of all. From the sun came down a beam of light, which burnt the shrine to ash. The dark night was brought upon it. Gundyr would become a judge to the next generations of Firelinkers who would come after Ludleth to the shrine. When the dawn rose, once more, in the distant future, and the bell rang to call the unkindled from their graves, he tested their worth in a trial of combat. Before I end the video, I'll point out some additional observations. Ludleth was able to transpose an object from a soul without wasting it entirely. It explains why the Witch Tree was able to absorb Arstor's soul when a chunk of it had been used to make the skull ring. When the Ashen One hands him his own transposing kiln, which had been discarded and absorbed by the curse-rotted Greatwood, he comments on its damaged status, which is the explanation as to why he can't fully transpose the contents of the souls anymore. Only a single object can be extracted from its memories before it is lost to darkness. Arstor is inspired by Vlad, the Impaler, who also inspires Dracula and similar anti-Christic figures. In fact, the aptly named Crucifixion Woods and its history are themed after vampires and werewolves more generally. Arstor would have become like a supreme puss of man in his Soulfeeder form. Think of the Snake Soul boss fight that was cut from Dark Souls 3, but would later be reworked for Elden Ring as the Oceiros 3 spirits. It is fitting that the two brothers who had to struggle against the greed of the serpent within themselves had as their ultimate enemy a literal serpent of darkness. The consumed King's Garden mirrors the biblical Garden of Eden. Oceiros wanted to reproduce the perfected, immortal man, a homunculus free from the first sin, the alchemical Rebis, within his secluded garden. And for those wondering, yes, I will explain, in depth, the entirety of Dark Souls 3, covering each detail, uncovering every secret, not just of Dark Souls 3, but of the series in general. I will explain, in a future upload, the nature of the intended graves as we visit it. But please, feel free to ask me anything in the comments. I'm always glad to respond. And this is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post in-depth analysis of works of an esoteric nature, ranging from movies to manga to music clips, as well as my insights on philosophy and religion, you can check out my Patreon.